Hey folks, I'm JB Shreve with the Faithful Considerations podcast. We are in episode 12 today of the Manifesto, Life, Politics, and Reality in the Kingdom of God. We're looking at the Sermon on the Mount, Matthew 5 through 7, and this historic, revolutionary message from Jesus Christ. Today, and actually for the next two episodes, we're going to be looking at the greatest obstacle in the earth to the Kingdom of God. All right? So, I grew up in the Bible Belt. The Bible Belt of America. That's a region largely in the southern part of the United States, the heart of the Christian right, at the apex of the Christian right movement in the 80s and 90s. Now, some people might see the timeline of the Christian right's apex differently, but that's where I see it, okay? I don't consider myself part of the Christian right today. Definitely not, right? But I also have no regrets when I did consider myself a part of the Christian right. It was part of my Christian journey, part of my spiritual journey. If you've ever read my most recent book, Politically Incorrect: Real Faith in an Era of Unreal Politics, then you know a lot of the story of that journey that I get into there. But growing up and engaging with that movement, I remember being so outraged by the likes of people like President Clinton. That was back in the 1990s. It seemed so obvious that this man was opposed to the kingdom of God, opposed to faith, opposed to the Bible, opposed to Christianity. He and his wife both, for that matter, right? I wasn't so blind as to believe that Republicans were totally pro-kingdom of God and Democrats were totally anti-kingdom of God. I knew there were charlatans within the Republican Party as well as the Democratic Party. But there were a lot of Christians in the Republican Party too, a lot of influential, a lot of intelligent Christians who called themselves Republicans. If nothing else, this was my perspective at that time, the Republican Party was at least better oriented towards my faith than the Democratic Party was. That's the way I saw it back then. And even though I knew God wasn't a Republican, he wasn't a Democrat, surely he leaned a little more one way than the other, right? Now, years passed, and I began to see the message of the Bible a bit differently. It struck me at one point how contradictory the New Testament seemed to be on the issue of politics. On the one hand, Jesus used extremely politically charged language. We've talked about that, right? He talked about a kingdom. He over and over again. Throughout the Gospels, he's talking about the kingdom. Keep in mind, he's doing that even in the midst of an occupied nation. And he had to know this would stir up trouble from the occupying Roman powers at the time. He used words like church and fellowship, which in the original Greek, the writings of the New Testament, these words could have been a number of different selections, but the writers of the New Testament specifically chose Greek words that had specific and deliberate political meanings. We've talked about that in an earlier episode. None of this was a surprise to the early church and the followers of Jesus. When they heard Jesus speak, they heard a political message because the message of the kingdom of God was explicitly a political message. Just maybe not the politics we mean when we say politics today. There was a reason why the Romans hung a sign that said King of the Jews over Jesus' mutilated carcass as he hung on the cross. And there was a reason why the religious leaders from among the Jews said, hey, don't say he's the King of the Jews, but that he claimed to be the King of the Jews, right? Everyone understood Jesus was talking politics. He was talking about a kingdom. He was talking about a new society, a new age of history. But then here's the paradox, or the contradiction, if you will. If Jesus was talking politics, then why did he hardly ever address or interact with any of the political leaders of the day? He wasn't scared. This had to be deliberate. Everything he did was on purpose and guided by the will and the speaking of God. The Herod monarchy was notoriously corrupt and wicked. Remember, these were the kings, the Herods, the king family of kings. They actually tried to have Jesus killed when he was an infant. A slaughter of infants was carried out by Herod in the town of Bethlehem that year. Later, another member of the Herod family had John the Baptist beheaded. This particular Herod was angry because John the Baptist confronted him over his adultery with his own brother's wife. But Jesus never confronted the Herods. He never did. I mean, it's just a fact. It never happened. There are a few slight comments by Jesus regarding the Herod family. In Luke 13, verses 31 to 33, you can see that. But over the course of his ministry, despite the fact that Jesus was clearly and blatantly very political in his teachings and his interactions with those around him, he never dealt with the ruling, corrupt leaders of Palestine. Now, this trend continued with the New Testament writers. And with the activities of like Peter and Paul and other disciples. The Roman Emperor Nero, he was notoriously wicked and corrupt. He was the first to carry out this widespread persecution against Christians. There are stories of Nero hanging the bodies of Christians, the dying bodies of Christians, in his garden, lighting them on fire so he and his friends could party beneath the light of the burning bodies at night. Remember, it was Nero's persecution that killed both Peter and Paul. They were martyred during that persecution. And yet, barely any mention of this wicked and corrupt ruler in the New Testament. In fact, on more than one occasion, we're encouraged to obey the civic and political authorities of the land. And this is the guy who was emperor when those verses were written in the New Testament. The lack of mention, the lack of confrontation between the citizens of the kingdom of God and the rulers of this world wasn't because Jesus and the early church were not sophisticated or educated enough to handle this political exchange. Not at all. It was because they saw the world differently than the way many of us see the world today. Just like in the days of Jesus, in the days of the early church, the greatest obstacle to the kingdom of God isn't the Roman Empire. It's not Donald Trump. It's not Joe Biden. It's really not, all right? A lot of people really struggle with this because we're being deceived in a lot of churches today where they're looking at political power rather than the kingdom of God, all right? In the days of Jesus' ministry, in the beginning of the church, real power, even real political power, was not with Herod or Rome. It was the spiritual dimension. There's an unseen reality going on all around us, and that's where the real struggle is taking place. That's the way Paul wrote about it in Ephesians 6:12. For we're not fighting against flesh and blood enemies, but against evil rulers and authorities of the unseen world, against mighty powers in this dark world, and against evil spirits in the heavenly places. Now again, I go a lot more in depth on this and in my recent book. I'm not going to go too far down that road today. If you're curious about it, then get the book, right? But here's what I want to look at today. Jesus, in his great manifesto of the kingdom of God, in this push toward political and social revolution called the kingdom, he didn't confront Herod. He didn't confront Nero or Pontius Pilate or any of these earthly rulers of the kingdoms of this world. But he did confront someone. One particular group. When it came to what made Jesus angry, what he saw as truly a force of opposition to the advance of the kingdom of God that he wanted to reckon with, he saw one group of people as the most dangerous obstacles to the kingdom of God. This is from Matthew 5:20, here in our manifesto, right? But I warn you, unless your righteousness is better than the righteousness of the teachers of religious law and the Pharisees, you will never enter the kingdom of heaven. It was the religious leaders, the scribes and the Pharisees, particularly, that Jesus observed as the real threat to the kingdom of God. I want to go a little deeper into this in the next episode, but for the sake of keeping these episodes at a reasonable viewing and listening time, I'm going to pause right here, okay? And we're going to pick this perspective up on how religion, the religious leaders, are the greatest obstacle to the advancement of the kingdom in the next episode here at the Faithful Considerations podcast. So this is kind of like a part A, and we're going to go into part B in the next episode. You can go ahead and pick that up today if you want to listen to it or watch the video. We'll be back soon, and thanks for listening, folks.